بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. Last week we spoke about the Gaza war of 2012 and how the then president of Egypt, Muhammad Morsi, rahimahullah, was able to negotiate a ceasefire. So after that, things somewhat calmed down for a period of time. Of course, the restrictions on Gaza remained in place. The blockade of Gaza remained in place, but the fighting between both sides, between the Israeli government and between Hamas in Gaza, it calmed down for a period of time. Then in 2014, there was another war between the Zionist occupation and the people of Gaza. And the event that was the precursor for the war of 2014 was an incident that took place in June of 2014, where there were 3 Israeli teenagers that were kidnapped and killed in the West Bank. And Israel immediately blamed Hamas for these kidnappings and these killings. Hamas denied that they had anything to do with it. And Israel had no proof that Hamas was behind the kidnapping and the killing of these 3 kids. But even though they had no proof, they blamed Hamas, and they used that as an excuse. They used that as a false justification to start another war on the Palestinian people. And it would not be something difficult to imagine if the Israelis orchestrated this whole thing themselves. That is something that is very possible, and they're known to play these type of dirty games. They may have orchestrated this whole thing themselves, because Hamas denied responsibility for this. They said we had nothing to do with it. If they had done it, they would have come out and said that yes, we did this. But they denied that they had anything to do with it. But the Israelis, without any proof, they blamed them anyways. So it very well could be that the Israelis orchestrated this whole thing themselves in order to provide a cover or to provide a justification for them to start another war upon the Palestinians. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So the response of the Zionist occupation to the kidnapping and the killing of these 3 Israeli teenagers, it was a very disproportionate response. In response to this, the Israeli military launched an operation that they called Operation Brother's Keeper. Operation Brother's Keeper. And this was launched in June of 2014. In this operation, the Israeli military raided 6,000 Palestinian homes. They raided more than 6,000 Palestinian homes. They shut down 219 Palestinian organizations, and they arrested more than 500 Palestinians without any charges. They stormed homes, they stormed universities, they targeted journalists and the press, right? It was supposedly an act of defense. They called it an act of defense, and they said that the Palestinians started it by killing these teenagers, according to what they said. So they said, we're just defending ourselves. But the reality was they were using this as an excuse to unleash a great slaughter upon the Palestinian people. And they had done this many times in their history before, as we have gone over. So this was not the first time they did such a disproportionate thing. They were basically saying every Palestinian is responsible for what happened, and every Palestinian, whether he's a combatant or not, whether he's a man or a woman or a child, every Palestinian is responsible for what happened to these three Israelis, and every Palestinian must pay the price. That was the attitude that the Israeli military had. So from amongst those that the Israeli military killed in these raids was a man named Ahmad Arafat Sabrin. And he was a young man. Maybe he was in his late teens or early 20s. And he was shot through the chest in one of the refugee camps that the Palestinians had. So the Israeli soldiers entered that refugee camp with their guns drawn, and they were searching the homes, raiding the homes. And this young man happened to be in that place at that time, and he was shot through the chest and he was killed. An innocent young man who had nothing to do with anything, he was killed by the Israeli military. A few days later, on June 20th, a man or a kid named Mahmoud Jihad Muhammad Dudin, he was killed as well. There was a raid in his town, and he went outside to see what was going on. He heard the sounds, and he just went outside just to see what was happening, and he was shot by a bullet from the Israeli military with no warning at all. 14-year-old kid killed in cold blood like that. That same day, a young man named Mustafa Husni Aslan, in another one of the refugee camps, his camp was raided by these Israeli soldiers, and he was shot in the head. Right? Just like that. These Palestinians, they had no weapons, they had no guns, nothing. But the Israeli military felt that they had the right to execute them and assassinate them without any type of feeling at all. Without any type of remorse or any type of guilt, they went ahead killing whoever they wanted to kill. And we see now that this is a pattern of the Israeli military. This is the way that they operate. A couple of weeks later, on July 2nd, there was a young teenager. His name was Muhammad Abu Khudair. He was around 16 years old. So it was before the Fajr prayer in East Jerusalem. It was before the Fajr prayer, and he went out of his home to go to the masjid for Salatul Fajr. And there are some small cafeterias and some small shops in those areas that are open usually during that time. So he went before the Fajr prayer, and he went to one of those cafeterias to buy a drink. So he went to the cafeteria, and there were some Israelis who saw him there. And they grabbed him, and they beat him up, and then they burned him alive. They burned him alive. Just a 16-year-old kid who went to buy a drink before going to Salatul Fajr at the masjid. This was in East Jerusalem. So he was taken by these Israeli extremists. He was beaten up, and then he was burned alive. And the reasoning that these Israelis gave behind this is they said that this is our revenge for what happened to the 3 Israeli teenagers who were killed. This kid had nothing to do with it. He's a 16-year-old boy minding his own business, and they thought that they had the right to execute him as a revenge for what happened to those 3 Israelis. So look at the mentality and the attitude of these people. They comfortably, without any guilt, they kill innocent people, and they don't feel bad about it at all. Right? This is the barbaric nature of these people. So these killings, all of these killings that we just mentioned here, they were not accidents. Rather, they were acts that the Israelis carried out intentionally to show their domination over the Palestinian people. They wanted to show that, look, we have the upper hand and you are the lowly Palestinians. We are the lofty Israelis, and we will dominate you. We have control over you. They wanted to show this. وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. So these are some of, and there were so many more, but these are just a few snippets of some of the innocent people who were killed by the Israelis during this time period in 2014. So of course, especially after the assassination or the execution of Muhammad Abu Khudair, a 16-year-old kid who was burned alive, innocent kid, right? Especially after this, the streets of the West Bank boiled. The Palestinians were very, very angry. And of course, the Palestinian youths, they tried to protest with the stones that they had. They were throwing stones. The only weapons they have is stones, right? So they protested with the stones that they had. And that's all that they could do, right? But Israel, of course, responded to the throws of these stones. They responded with live ammunition. You throw stones at their tanks, they're going to shoot you with their Uzis and with their machine guns, right? So this is what they did. So this was going on in the West Bank and going on in Jerusalem. So Gaza knew that their turn is going to come next. If this is happening in the West Bank, then Gaza knew that soon the military is going to attack Gaza. And that is exactly what happened. A few days later, on July 8th, 2014, Israel launched another operation that they called Operation Protective Edge. They called it Operation Protective Edge. And they stated that their goal, their objective in this operation was to destroy the tunnels of Hamas. They said, our objective in this operation, we want to destroy the underground tunnels that Hamas have built, right? So that was their stated intention. But in reality, what happened? They bombarded Gaza for 50 straight days. There were more than 6,000 airstrikes that they launched upon Gaza. And they did not differentiate between military targets or civilian targets. They said their goal was to destroy the tunnels, but they were basically destroying everything that they could see. Similar to what happened in the current war. They destroyed as much of Gaza as they could. So they bombarded and they bombed entire neighborhoods. They killed hundreds and hundreds of people in single strikes. In each strike, they killed hundreds of people. There were families that were torn apart in seconds, right? And children's bodies had to be pulled out from rubble. Operations, doctors were trying to do operations, but they had no electricity because they bombed all of the infrastructure points as well. So no electricity. So doctors in Gaza were trying to perform operations on these children who had lost their limbs in these strikes, and they have no light. How is a surgeon going to operate without light? They were trying to use the light from their cell phones. They were trying to turn on the flashlight on their cell phones in order to have enough light to do operations. That's how dire the situation was. And parents, they knew that the strikes were hitting all around, and they knew that they could be next. So parents would actually write the names of their children on the legs of the children. They would write the names of the children on the legs, so that if these children were killed, they could be identified. It could be known who they were, right? This was the desperation of the parents. They knew that, their kids could be killed in an instant, and they wanted the bodies to be recognized if their children were killed. Imagine living, with these type of thoughts in your mind constantly, that a bomb could hit us any minute, our children could be killed in any instant, such to the extent that you have to write the names of your children on their legs, right? Imagine a parent having to go through that. But this is the reality of the people of Gaza. This is what they lived through, and this is what they continue to live through. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant them relief, right? That's the situation. So at the end of this war, the 2014 Gaza war, more than 2,200 Palestinians were killed, including more than 550 children, right? It lasted for about a couple of months. And in that time period, over 2,200 Palestinians were killed. And included in that 2,200 were more than 550 children. They bombed schools as well. Children were in school and those schools were bombed and entire classrooms were wiped out in an instant. So that was the death toll, more than 2,200. But more than 11,000, in addition to that, more than 11,000 were injured. Many people, they lost their limbs. Many people, they lost their vision. They became blind. Many people lost their ability to walk. They lost their mobility. And also in terms of the property damage, more than 100,000 Palestinian homes were damaged or destroyed. So basically, Gaza became homeless inside its own borders because of the level of destruction that the Israeli military unleashed upon these people. They even bombed the UN safe houses. The UN, they had designated some spaces, some places, and said, these are safe houses. You can go here to escape from the bombardment. But the Israeli military bombarded those safe houses as well. Right? They bombarded the UN so-called safe houses as well. They don't care. They don't care at all. Right? So of course, what was committed in 2014 was undoubtedly a war crime by the Israeli military. There's no question about that. Of course, we know that international law says that civilian areas must not be targeted. But they target civilian areas purposely and intentionally. International law also says that the response to any attack must be proportional, right? It should not be disproportionate. But the Israeli military always, when they attack and they call it self-defense, it's always disproportionate to an extreme level. And international law also says that occupation forces must protect civilians under occupation. The Israeli government does not care about that at all. So Israel constantly violates all of these international laws, and the UN is supposedly supposed to hold them to account, but Israel doesn't care about what the UN says, and the UN really does nothing to enforce its guidelines, right? That's why instead of the United Nations, I like to call it the useless nations, because they talk a lot, but they don't get anything done. So after the war of 2014, there were some psychological studies on the children of Gaza. You know, children going through this type of a war and having to experience this type of trauma, it's something that really, really has long-term effects on the children. So psychologists who went into Gaza after the 2014 war and had interviews with these families and with these children, they said that nearly every single child, almost 100% of the children in Gaza, they show signs of trauma, right? And some of the signs of that, like the children, they wet the bed at night due to their anxiety. They have night terrors, they have anxiety, they have speech loss, right? These are all of the effects of the trauma that they have gone through. Some of these children, they had lived through 4 wars before they reached the age of 10. Can you imagine that? Living through 4 wars where you don't know if you're going to live or die before you reach the age of 10. So of course, this is a traumatic experience for an adult. So imagine the trauma that a child feels when he has to go through this type of an experience. So this was the war, the Gaza war of 2014. And there was finally a ceasefire on August 26th of 2014. So it went on for approximately 2 months, from June to August of 2014. So there was a ceasefire that was called on August 26th, 2014, and it ended the bombing that was going on between both sides, but it did not end the siege of Gaza. And it did not end the day-to-day violence that continued to happen in the West Bank. It did not end the fear that the people of Palestine had to continuously go through. And they continue to go through on a daily basis, not knowing what is going to happen next, right? And at the end of the day, at the end of this war of 2014, even though a ceasefire was called, Gaza was left in ruins. It was almost completely destroyed. And reconstruction was blocked. So it was destroyed, and they were not allowed to rebuild because they were not allowed to bring in the materials needed for reconstruction because of the siege, the blockade of Gaza. Right? It's an open-air prison. So they were not allowed to bring in what was necessary to rebuild after all of that destruction. Right? So this is what happened in 2014. So you're seeing a pattern here that every few years Gaza is attacked. Gaza is bombarded. Innocent civilians in Gaza are targeted and killed. Property in Gaza is destroyed. Right? This has been happening in Gaza since 2007, specifically in Gaza. Right? Constant wars in Gaza and constant destruction of Gaza. And of course, the violence in Palestine has been happening since the last 75 years, 76 years. Right? But the specific targeting of Gaza in the way that it is being targeted now, this has been happening on a constant basis since 2007, as we spoke about before. Right? So every couple of years, there's something that the Israeli uses as a justification to go and bomb Gaza. And the latest example of that is what we just saw recently. Right? But it happened many times before, and 2014 was an example of that as well. So, of course, after the ceasefire, the world moved on, pretty much forgot about Gaza once again. But of course, the Palestinians, they could not forget. They had to continue to live in that reality, right? So that was the Gaza war of 2014. And the situation of the people of Gaza has not really changed since then. The siege is still intact. The blockade is still there. And the people of Gaza still continue to suffer to this day. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant our brothers and our sisters and our children in Gaza relief from the difficulties that they have been going through for so many years. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant them victory over their enemy. Ameen. Inshallah, we will stop there for today, bi'idhnillah, and in our next session we will continue more with the history of the Holy Land, bi'idhnillah. Jazakumullahu khaira wa barakallahu feekum. Wallahu a'lam wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi.